Hello students, this is the second narration for the respiratory system, and while there are only a few slides, the most important information that you need to know with regards to the physiology of the respiratory system will be found in this narration. So we'll start with this slide, which is on spirometry. So what is spirometry? If you have already looked at the lab, you will see that spirometry is a process, an activity. A spirometer is the instrument that's used, and spirometry allows for the measurement of a variety of volume of air in someone's lung. And so it's kind of like an experiment, really. Now, for your lab, you were given the same graph that you are seeing here. So let me just grab a pen. Probably we'll use blue here. So you had this graph being shown to you, and this part here also there. This here was not shown on your diagram for the lab. This was shown and that was shown. So let's start with just this part here. So one of the first measurements that one can make with the spirometer is to measure something called the tidal volume. And the tidal volume is the volume of air that you would breathe in normally. So I think all of us know that we can take a deep breath and fill our lungs to capacity. That is not what we're talking about here. So we're talking about what is often called quiet breathing, the kind of breathing you do when you're just sitting and there's no exertion involved. There's no physical activity, you're studying, you're reading, you're writing, etc. So with a spirometer, you can measure the tidal volume for someone by asking them to breathe in and out normally first so that they're relaxed, and then taking the spirometer before they put the spirometer into their mouth, and you always blow out into a spirometer. You never inhale. So you would inhale normally, then put the spirometer into your mouth, pinch your nose so your nostrils, no air can come through your nostrils, and then you would breathe out normally into the spirometer. And there's a dial, which will show what that volume is. And so for a normal, healthy male, and so here is something again to remember, that many of the measurements that are given in anatomy and physiology textbooks are usually for a young adult male, roughly around 21 years of age, in the peak of health. So we do know that these volumes change based on gender. So whether you're male or female, height, age, are you young, are you old, do you exercise a lot, or do you have a more sedentary lifestyle, etc. So what I will say to you is it's good to know these numbers that we're quoting. So for example, tidal volume is roughly 500 mils, but that applies again to a young adult male. So that's tidal volume, air exchange during normal, quiet breathing. Now, as you can see on the graph, there are volumes. Inspiratory reserve volume. We just did tidal volume. And then there is expiratory reserve volume. Whereas on this side, we see something called vital capacity and total lung capacity. So capacities are not volumes. Capacities are found by adding several volumes together. And again, in your lab, you have been given the equations for these calculations. So I just wanted to make that clear. So what is inspiratory reserve volume? Well, it's descriptive. Inspiration is taking air in, inhalation. Reserve, usually, it's kind of like when you have reserve funds. That's money you put aside. You don't use it on a regular basis, and it is there in case you need it. It's the same idea here. So this is the volume of air outside of or beyond that tidal volume that we can hold in our lungs or bring into our lungs. So inspiratory reserve volume does not include tidal volume. So inspiratory reserve volume, to measure that, again, the person would take an inhale, an exhale, normally relaxed, and then they would inhale as much as possible, but they would exhale normally into the spirometer. And that would give us a measure of the inspiratory reserve volume. There's also an expiratory reserve volume. So an expiratory reserve volume, this is like the flip side to inspiratory reserve volume. This is now the amount of air that you can send out of the lungs by a forceful expiration. So in that case, the person would be asked again to inhale normally, exhale normally so that they're relaxed. And then you would ask them to inhale normally, but they would exhale as much as possible into the spirometer. And that would be measured. And that would be called the expiratory reserve volume. So there are values that textbooks like to quote. And for the lab, you've been given some, what are normal reading values for certain things. One of the things you would have noticed if you were doing this experimentally is that the expiratory reserve volume is never equal to the inspiratory reserve volume. And again, expiratory reserve does not include tidal volume. So the question is why? And the answer to that question is that some air is always left in the lung to keep the alveoli inflated. Now, residual volume is this volume of air that is never really expired. So we never empty our lungs fully. That's the bottom line, even if we're doing a forceful exhalation. So the residual volume is roughly twice as much as the tidal volume. So the tidal volume is roughly 500 mils. Residual volume is about a liter, 1,000 milliliters. So note the unit is milliliters here. Now to find vital capacity, one can sum the inspiratory reserve, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve, and that will give you the vital capacity of the person. It does not include residual volume. If we add vital capacity to residual volume, then we get what is called the total lung capacity. So physiologists find these values to be very useful to them in attending to maybe athletes, etc. Doctors find it very useful, especially doctors who specialize in lung or respiratory system disorders, because again, depending on the person's age and what type of disease they might have, doctors may be able to say whether the condition that they have is improving or it's not improving. So I hope that sort of gives you a little bit of the flavor for spirometry. So the lab is very useful to help you understand this methodology, the values, etc. I didn't say much about inspiratory capacity and functional residual capacity, but you can see how these can be calculated. Inspiratory capacity is IRV plus TV, and so forth. So let's move on to the next slide. And so we want to look at two very important processes that occur in terms of the physiology of the respiratory system. We have gone through the fact that we need to take in oxygen, and oxygen is used for the combustion of glucose. So this is cellular respiration, where glucose in the mitochondria is combusted using oxygen, and in the process we produce carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So I'm going to stop here, but we know we have two other products that are formed. Now, the oxygen that we breathe in is used entirely in the body by all cells, with few exceptions, to carry out this process. And the carbon dioxide that we breathe out, every time we take a breath, in, we're getting some oxygen, we breathe out, expiration, we're sending carbon dioxide out to the body. This is where the carbon dioxide is coming from. No other process. So let's look then more closely, because we have two exchanges that occur. You already met these when we did the cardiovascular system, when we were talking about the pulmonary circuit. You learned that blood is sent from the right ventricle to the lungs. It's taken there using the pulmonary arteries. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen, and the pulmonary veins bring the blood back to the left atrium. It then flows into the left ventricle, which then pumps it to the systemic circuit, so that all the blood that goes out into the aorta and all the arteries that branch from the aorta, this is carrying oxygenated blood. So that's one exchange, the exchange in the lungs. So there's a great connection here between the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. The second exchange was also discussed when we did the cardiovascular system, and this is the one that occurs in the tissues and cells of the different organs of the body, with the exception of the lungs. So all that oxygenated blood flows via arteries, because arteries take oxygenated blood to all the organs in the body, again, except the lungs. So each cell needs to get oxygen to carry out cellular respiration. And each cell needs to send the carbon dioxide that's being produced out of the cell, because carbon dioxide is toxic to cells. So another exchange has to occur there between the blood that's arriving and the tissue cells. So lung capillaries, we have one exchange occurring. That exchange we usually call external respiration, because it is taking place between the external air that came into the lungs and the blood capillaries surrounding the alveoli. The exchange that takes place in the tissue, cells, and organs of the body, that one is referred to as internal respiration. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind as you process this information is which gases are leaving blood and where are they going, and which gases are entering blood and where do they come from. So let's take a look. Hemoglobin, which you probably have heard of, is a protein So it's a protein that's important. And it's the most popular protein when one is discussing protein structure. Protein structure as in protein, a protein that has a quaternary structure. So quaternary, quatch usually means 4. So it's made up of 4 protein subunits, and we can sort of see them here. That would be 1. Around here would be another one, 2. This one would be 3, and that would be the 4th one. So these 4 subunits are made of a protein called globin. So that's how it got the name hemoglobin. And the 4 subunits are not functional by themselves. It's only when they fold, because you remember that proteins have to fold to form a final functional structure. Now, the important thing is that one hemoglobin molecule, which is shown here, has 4 iron atoms. So this blue here represents the element iron, as in Fe is iron. Okay, the symbol for iron, you've done enough chemistry to know this, is Fe. So it's for this reason that, if you don't get enough iron in your diet, you become what is called anemic. And usually you're very tired because the function of the iron is this is where oxygen will bind. So hemoglobin is an important protein because it will carry oxygen gas. So when a molecule of oxygen binds with hemoglobin, a new compound is formed. It's called oxyhemoglobin. So each of these iron atoms will have oxygen bound to it. So when hemoglobin does not have oxygen bound to the iron atom, that's what we called in the cardiovascular system, we call that deoxygenated blood. And when oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, that's what we called in the cardiovascular system oxygenated blood or oxygen-rich blood. Here you're learning a little bit more chemistry, so please make sure you know this equation. And so this will occur in the lungs because red blood cells present in the capillaries of the lungs will pick up oxygen. Oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin molecule present in erythrocytes. So oxyhemoglobin, HbO2, is the chemical formula for oxyhemoglobin. HbO2, oxyhemoglobin, is how oxygen is transported by erythrocytes from the lungs to all parts of the body. So when we say that the pulmonary veins bring oxygenated blood to the heart, we could say the pulmonary veins are carrying oxyhemoglobin. They mean the same thing, oxygenated blood and oxyhemoglobin. So it's important to know the name, the equation, where this occurs. And like I said earlier, this exchange, this binding of oxygen to hemoglobin, this occurs in the lungs, and that process occurring in the lungs is called external respiration. So this is one of the gases. On another slide, we will talk about what happens to carbon dioxide. But both of these exchanges will occur at the same time. When I say both, I mean oxygen will be loaded into blood and carbon dioxide will be unloaded from the blood in the lungs. So the process occurs by diffusion, and diffusion, is driven by a gradient from high concentration to low concentration. So the low concentration is in the capillary because the capillary does not have any oxygen, it just has loads of carbon dioxide. And inside the air inside the lungs, which is the alveolus, has a high concentration of oxygen. So diffusion will be from the alveolus into the blood capillaries. The binding occurs, and this is how oxygen is transported around the body. Now, what happens when the oxygenated blood gets to the tissue cell? Well, this in the tissue cell, that is internal respiration, and so a dissociation occurs. Oxygen leaves hemoglobin, and the oxygen diffuses into the cells of the tissue of the organ where the capillary is present. So oxygen can bind to hemoglobin quite easily, and oxygen can dissociate from hemoglobin also quite easily. Now, we like to think actually of hemoglobin as, binding oxygen, a gas. The truth is, hemoglobin actually can bind 3 different gases. Hemoglobin can bind carbon dioxide, and I will get to that a little bit later. But the important thing to note is when hemoglobin binds carbon dioxide, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit here. The carbon dioxide does not bind to the iron. So it does not compete for binding to this site. Carbon dioxide actually binds to a part of this protein, the globin protein. It does not bind to the iron. But the other gas, carbon monoxide, binds here. So carbon monoxide competes with oxygen for binding if it's present in the atmosphere, and this is why carbon monoxide actually can kill us. Because once it binds, it holds on really, really strong. It doesn't let go. And so if cells are starved for oxygen, well, they can't function. Brain cells die, heart cells will die, etc. And that is how carbon monoxide actually kills. So I'm just telling you that. That isn't, that's more general information, but so often students go through biology and they think that hemoglobin only binds oxygen. And it's good to know that that isn't really true. So on to the next slide. Now here, we're looking at carbon dioxide. So recall that carbon dioxide is made in the cells during cellular respiration. We just went through this in the last slide. So here's carbon dioxide as a product. Carbon dioxide will diffuse from the cells, the tissues of the organ into systemic blood capillaries. So this is now when we call it deoxygenated blood being returned to the heart by all the veins except the pulmonary veins, right? And so yes, this blood is sent to the lungs, so carbon dioxide gas can be exhaled. Now, there is an equation, another equation that you have to know for carbon dioxide, and there isn't one method that is used to transport carbon dioxide actually. So let's take a look. Water, when combined with carbon dioxide, produces a substance called carbonic acid. So you should know the chemical formula, this one right here, H2CO3, that is carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is actually very unstable. So it dissociates into 2 ions, bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3-, you should know that from chemistry, and hydrogen ions. So the majority of carbon dioxide is actually transported as the bicarbonate ion. Some of it is transported, like I said, by binding to hemoglobin. So CO2 can be carried in a red blood cell by binding to the globin chain, but only a small amount. Most of carbon dioxide is carried as the bicarbonate ion. So when we look at external respiration, what needs to happen then is, here is the, well, let's do oxygen first, since we were just talking about that. This is the alveolus, this is blood plasma, and this is the barrier here, the membranes over which these gases must travel, diffuse, okay? So oxygen, obviously, in the alveoli need to diffuse out and go into the red blood cell. That's easy enough because it's done by a concentration gradient, right? High to low, high to low. Now, carbon dioxide will be present in the blood that has arrived at the lungs. The carbon dioxide is present as the bicarbonate ion. So what will happen is the bicarbonate ion combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid. And then there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that's present in red blood cells that forces the H2CO3, the carbonic acid, to dissociate into carbon dioxide. And then the carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveolus, and then we breathe that out. Breathe out. A small amount of the carbon dioxide was bound to hemoglobin, so that's called HbCO2, carbaminohemoglobin. And that also dissociates again and releases its hold on the hemoglobin so that the hemoglobin is free to bind oxygen. And so that carbon dioxide also diffuses into the alveolus. So in external respiration, oxygen is loaded into the red blood cells and binds to the iron in hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is unloaded from blood, diffuses into the alveolus, and we breathe that out. So that's the bottom line of what happens in external respiration. In internal respiration, this is, in the organs of the body, in the tissues, the cells were carrying out cellular respiration, so they're producing lots of CO2 and ATP, but it's the CO2 that's harmful, so we have to get rid of it. So the CO2 diffuses into across the membrane again, so this would be the cells this time, not alveolus, and this would be blood plasma. So we've got one red blood cell shown here, and we know that CO2 will diffuse across the membrane, and this equation will occur where you have H2O, so the water that makes up plasma or present in plasma, combines with the carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid, and then that dissociates to form the bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. So what will be present in blood is lots of bicarbonate ions. Some of the hemoglobin will be free because the oxygen will dissociate from the hemoglobin. So O2, so it's shown here, O2 will dissociate and go into the cells, so the cells can continue to produce ATP. But the free hemoglobin now, the globin chain of the hemoglobin molecule, can now bind some of the carbon dioxide. So a small amount is transported by hemoglobin. majority is transported as the bicarbonate ion. So this is internal respiration. So in internal respiration, oxygen is unloaded from blood and it goes into the tissue cell, and carbon dioxide moves from the tissue cells and it's loaded into blood. And that's the blood we call deoxygenated blood or carbon dioxide rich blood. That's the blood that flows into the venules, then the veins, and then all the veins send their blood to the inferior and superior vena cava, and that's what goes back to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it'll go into the right ventricle, from the right ventricle via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and the whole process continues again. So this connection between the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system, you are expected to really understand the connection between the two organ systems and appreciate the complexity and how they really work together, because we see this when we're exercising. Muscles demand more ATP when we're exercising. Our heart rate goes up to deliver the glucose to the muscle cells, but our respiratory rate also has to go up. We have to breathe faster. We have to get that oxygen in and provide it to the muscles so that they can, the cells can do their job of providing the ATP. And when we can't do that, we're fatigued. Either the muscle is tired or we're out of breath and we have to stop anyway. So this is why training for athletic endeavors and practice is very necessary if one really wants to become good at any of it. And so that was the last slide. You can do the learning check, and I will see you for the digestive system, I think, comes after this. So that will be the next set of narrations.